Hey there, I'm Jay. Welcome to my booth. One of you asked me to cover the plugins and post-processing effects that I use in my audio, so here we are. Just a quick rundown of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to first go through just the plugins that I use, show you the settings that each of them have, for those of you who sort of know what you're doing and just want to know what I do. And then afterwards, I'll walk through what each of them does specifically, how to tweak the settings, and a more in-depth rundown for folks who want more of a tutorial rather than an example, I guess. So to start off with, I've got Adobe Audition open here, and over on the left side are the effects that I use in my processing. It's pretty sparse. And the way I like to think of an effect stack is sort of the Brita filter for your audio, where you take the raw, unfiltered water, pour it in the top, and it runs from top to bottom, and out of all of it you get clean, purified audio. What I would encourage folks not to think of post-processing, because it can be tempting, I know I was, to try and make it a Jesus moment where you pour water in the top and you get wine out of the bottom. You're not changing it from one thing to another. And really what I mean is, don't try to make yourself sound like something that you're not, because there is a niche for your voice. Don't try to sound like anybody else, because that's a fool's errand, in my opinion. Enough soapboxing, we can get into that later on if you have questions about it. But personal experience, that's what we're working with. So these are the plugins that I use. The first one is Izotope's RX Mouth DClicker. Izotope is a software developer that comes out with a bunch of different types of plugins. This comes as part of their RX Audio Repair Suite. I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to do voiceover in a professional capacity. This plugin specifically, and their whole suite of plugins, has saved me so much time, energy, and effort in the past. These are the settings that I use. Again, I'll break it down more in detail later on. Just make sure that you're getting the right package, though, if you're looking for the Mouth DClicker specifically. I think you have to pay for the standard, which is about $400. Again, well worth the investment, and no, I am not affiliated with them in any way. The next plugin I use is another Izotope. This is their Nectar plugin. It is a vocal specific, originally tailored more for music production, but it works just as well for voiceover and such. The first one here, Pitch, it works from left to right. The first one here, Pitch, is for music, so it's off for our intents and purposes. Next is a noise gate. These are the settings. It opens here, closes here. My release, if I want it to be a little aggressive, I'll put it at 170 milliseconds, and generally speaking, I'll have it at 225 milliseconds for most things that I'm doing. The only reason I have this gate here is to make editing easier for myself. If I'm punching in or stopping and starting my recordings, particularly for long-form recordings, you can just get some artifacts, or the click of my keyboard perhaps will get picked up at the tail end, and this just makes my life easier down the line. Next, I have an EQ. I've just got a high-pass filter set at about 60 hertz. I usually have it a little bit lower, 55. You can turn this up if you want. I find that for my voice, I do pick up a little bit of information if I leave it here from my voice. It may be something that only folks on really acute listening devices, like really good headphones or speakers, will actually hear, but I hear it, so I leave it in. The next thing is just a little bell cut. It's about 230 hertz, and this is just for room frequency buildup. The way that I can hunt this out is, well, I'll talk about that in a moment, but this is just to notch out some room frequency. For some of the microphones that I use, namely the 416, the Sennheiser 416 and the Neumann TLM 103, they can be a little sibilant on my voice. This microphone doesn't give me that issue, so this is off, but this is sort of my de-esser. And what I like about this plugin is it allows the attenuation at any frequency band to sort of turn on and off depending on how loud it is. So it works sort of like a compressor in that way. Again, I don't use it for this microphone, but for some I do. Then I use Multistage Compression, aka I just use 2 compressors. The first one has a higher ratio to just tame down the really sharp peaks in audio, and the next one is just a general compressor to just even everything out. The Multistage Compression just sort of spreads the load out between them and makes it sound a little more natural, less crunchy. These, I will tweak the settings per project. Generally for auditions, I'll just set it and forget it because it just has to be generally clean unless it's a big time audition. But for projects that I'm sending to clients, I tailor these specifically for each job. But generally speaking, they can be set about here. Good rule of thumb for compressors, if you're doing multi-stage compression, the more aggressive one with the higher ratio should just be cutting off the very large peaks. So in this audio, I'd probably set it to, I don't know, -12, something like that, -12, -10. And then the more gentle compressor, I try to get it so that it's attenuating about -1 to -3 at the peaks on average. And that's how I do that. Now, for those of you who don't know what any of that just was, or you'd like a rundown on the specific settings, let's dive in. The Mouth DClicker, it just hunts out little clicks and pops in your speech from your saliva, mouth, sinuses, whatever. Sensitivity is just how hard or ruthless it's going to be with what it determines as a click. Obviously, lower sensitivity, it's just going to filter out the really egregious clicking. Higher sensitivity, it's going to be pretty ruthless, and you may end up losing some information with it being really aggressive. The frequency skew, I find that depending on your anatomy and your voice and the way that your saliva is on any given day, this can be different from person to person. This setting works for me, but I found that through trial and error, which I would recommend everyone do. And then the click widening, that's just if this plugin detects a click, it will take into account an area around that click to essentially smooth out or sand down or buffer, whatever you want to call it. And the higher this number, the wider the region that it will repair. The lower the number, the more surgical this plugin gets. I find that around here is good for me. Next is the noise gate. So what a noise gate is if the volume gets louder than a certain level, in this case, -50 dB roughly, the gate will open, allowing the audio into the recording. And then of course, when it goes below this closing threshold, the gate will close or begin to close and not allow any audio through anymore. Sort of like a gatekeeper or bouncer for the audio, I guess. The rate at which the gate will close, so after the audio has dipped below this threshold that I've set at -52 dB, is set by my release. So how quickly you want it to close, you will shorten that. If you want it to be longer, a little bit longer. This setting you should probably tailor to your own speech patterns, and I would always err on the side of slower release if you can, because you may lose some information. The attack is how quickly it opens, and then this specific plugin has a cool ratio setting, so I can turn this down or up to make the level of the gate either absolute, more like a limiter, or less. To explain that a little further, what this ratio does is for every 1 decibel that the audio dips below my closing threshold, it will then turn down further by 11.17 or whatever this number is. So 15 to 1, for every 1 decibel, it's going to make it 15 decibels quieter. So for this plugin, I like that because if I want a gentle gate that just sort of turns down the intermediate stuff instead of absolutely chopping it out, I can make it a gentler ratio, like 2 to 1 or 4 to 1, something like that. That's a noise gate. If you'd like further clarification, let me know. Next up is the EQ, or equalizer. A high-pass filter is essentially anything below this frequency setting or this curve that I've set up here is cut out of the audio. Any frequencies that are higher than this frequency setting or this curve are allowed to pass through into my recording, a high pass filter. If it's a high frequency, it passes. This slope just determines how aggressive I want the chop to be. I just like it at 12, but you can play with that depending on where you want it. And the frequency at which to set this, I would say lower frequency voices start at start at 50 hertz and go up to maybe 80. Just hunt around in there and see where your voice sits. And if you start to lose any detail or information in your own voice as you're talking, then just drop those frequencies 5, 10 hertz and see if it changes anymore. For higher frequency voices, you may be able to go up to 100 hertz or even 120 hertz in some cases. Just play around with it and see what works best for you. For the resonant frequencies in your space, there are a couple of different ways you can figure this out. The first, there are softwares online where you can type in the dimensions of your recording space. So in my case, it would be like 4 feet by 3 feet by 7 feet. And it will tell you which frequencies in your space will have a buildup or resonance. A buildup or frequency resonance, different sound waves have literal physical lengths, and so certain frequencies in certain spaces will bounce back and forth between the walls perfectly. And bap, 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 they'll build up and get kind of boxy and overwhelm other frequencies. So to counteract that, you can hunt them out by either plugging in your dimensions there and then just applying a little attenuation or a dip in your EQ. Or what I like to do is just play the audio, give this a boost, turn the Q down so that it's a nice thin notch, and then just hunt out frequencies and listen. And as I'm playing the audio and listening through and scanning, if I hear a frequency that's particularly boomy or bassy, or it sounds just sort of distorted relative to the other frequencies, then that's more likely than not a resonant frequency, and I'll just dip the gain down to -2, -3 dB to lower those frequencies a little bit in volume, and then widen the Q out a little bit so it's less of a chop and more of just sort of a smoothing out. That's the way I like to do it. Some folks like to do specific little notches, which you may find. Generally speaking, with EQ, I find less is more. And trusting the people who designed your microphone that they know what they're doing and they've got your back. For this little de-esser, if that's something that you want to do and you find the S frequencies in your own recordings to be a little overwhelming at times, it's the same deal as what I just showed you, hunting out where you start to get the S's really popping, and you can just drop a little dip in that area and it'll tame them out a little bit. The reason I like this one again is it will adjust the amount of volume that it turns it down in accordance with how loud that section is. So if it's a really loud S sound, it'll turn it down more, and if it's not really a very loud S sound, it won't touch it as much, which I find more natural sounding. Last are the compressors. Again, I use multi-stage compression to share the load between them. The first has a high ratio, the second has a low ratio. The way compressors work, I like to think of them sort of as the rolling pins of the audio world. So if we look over here at this audio and think of it as like bread dough or pizza dough or whatever you want to think of it, cookie dough, pick your poison. There's loud points that have these really sharp peaks, and then it gets quiet, and then it gets really loud where I'm even clipping, and then it comes down quiet again, and then it gets loud again. If someone were to listen to this audio, they would have to be turning it down on the loud bits, turning it up on the quiet bits, and it's just not a very pleasant listening experience. And so what a compressor does is it makes it a nice, smooth ride in terms of volume, so that it's kind of consistent all the way through, more or less taking the loud parts and bringing them down to a similar level as the quiet parts. A compressor I like to think of as the sort of rolling pin of the audio plugin universe. And as a demonstration, if we take a look at what this waveform looks like now, it's pretty bumpy, pretty choppy. But if I take this compressor and I apply it to that audio, watch what happens. It's much flatter. There's no more high peaks. It's just sort of a smooth listening ride. Those loud portions are about the same volume as the quieter portions, or at least much closer in volume. Now, what I just showed you was an instance of over compression, because this audio is frankly not very good. Most audio that you'll see, or hopefully will see, will, to begin with, be more even. So the way a compressor works is we'll set the threshold, and that's when we start the compression. Any volume or any audio that goes above that in volume will then be compressed, or the rolling pin will start evening it out. And then the degree to which we compress that audio, or the amount of pressure we apply with that rolling pin to make it even, is determined by the ratio. The higher the ratio, the more pressure we're applying to smash it down and keep everything at that threshold. And the lower the ratio, we're being a little bit more gentle and sort of letting the audio be more in line with itself, the way it wants to be. For most voiceovers, you'll want to set it between 2:1 in the ratio. On the heavier side, I would say 4:1 on the ratio. And a good safe bet is right in the middle, 3:1. And to describe exactly what this ratio is, for every 1 decibel above the threshold in volume that any audio gets will then be reduced by 3, whatever the ratio is. The rate at which the compressor turns on is determined by the attack. For VoiceOver, this can be pretty fast, or around 5 milliseconds. The release is at what point or how quickly the compressor stops applying pressure and reducing volume after the audio's gone back below the threshold that you've set. So again, this can be relatively fast, and for us, I've just set it at 50 milliseconds arbitrarily, which is usually what I have mine set up as. Now, most compressors will have a makeup gain section, because, again, if I apply this compressor to this audio, it's made it quieter. This section right here was clipping. It was so loud. It was very loud, getting up into -1, -2, and now it's down at like -10, -12 dB. So this whole recording has gotten much, much quieter as a result of the compression. The makeup gain section in compressors just turns up the volume after it's gone through the compression. So if I turn that back on as I just did and reapply it, you'll notice that it's the audio looks much different and the volume is staying back up at like -4 at this point. That to me is more of a dealer's choice if you want to let the compressor do its job for you, or if you want to have a little bit more control and normalize everything after the fact. That's up to you. So that's my vocal chain, how they work to a degree. Again, I'll be releasing more in-depth videos on each of those plugins. If you have specific questions about any of them, please let me know down below, and I'm happy to go into more depth. If you're interested in having some help setting up an effects chain for yourself and your booth, your voice, I do that on my website, so you can look up that up there. And until the next one, be well, and I'll catch you then. Toodles.